Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Klaus Zimmermann. I'm the director of IZA, the Institute for the Study of Labor, based in Bonn, and I'm the professor at the same time at the University of Bonn on behalf of the Institute of the LSE, on Bloomsbury, of everybody who is part of this mission is tonight. I warmly welcome here tonight. I'm just here to briefly introduce you to the evening, so to speak, and then the panel will take over. Adam Austerfield will chair the panel, and my role is, so to speak, to briefly bring you to the mission. What is IZA? Well, IZA is not only a local research institute. It's also a worldwide platform of about 1,300 scientists around the globe who are interested in labor economics issues in a very broad sense. The one side from the academic side, that's the other side from the policy commitment. We are interested in real-world issues which are looking for a pressing answer. And now it came up this idea that we know a lot, but often policymakers don't know what we know, and what they want to know we often refuse to give answers. So let us bring us together, and the idea came up to produce a large collection of about 500 articles which condense the wisdom labor economists, broadly defined, have about particular clear issues. So issues where we have hopefully clear answers based on empirical facts. So this is part of a worldwide movement of evidence-based policymaking, which also has a big tradition in the UK, as in Australia and other parts in the United States, as we know. Also in Europe, but often gets pushed away from day-to-day pressures of policy making, and that's why we are went out to not only write these things, but also find strong partners in various areas. And one partner is the World Bank when it comes to development issues. So we are interested in labor issues and jobs, how to create jobs, how to improve everybody's life, and so the World Bank is our partner in the context of development economics. So we bring together labor and development issues, and we do it in many other areas: demography and labor, environmental issues and labor. So there's a broad focus. Now the other partner, we need a publisher. So Bloomsbury, I'm very happy that Nigel Newton is here, the head of Bloomsbury, is a very famous company based here in London, who is a strong arm bringing what we think and do to the wider world. So that's the basic idea. Now, the idea with this 10-pager is it was very hard work to develop it, I can say, and it's also very hard work for the scientists to write it, because to condense all what you know about a very specific topic on 10 pages is already difficult for scientists, but also make it readable, and also make it readable for policymakers or people around policymakers who also other decision makers, maybe in the media or in companies. And that's why we developed what you see here outside. If you go back to the tea bar or the coffee bar later, you see these little flyers, so to speak, and you see there how the top page is organized. So we have something like a short title, we have a teaser which can be on Twitter, we have an elevator pitch, or something I had to learn, what is this, an elevator pitch? Okay, you're on the elevator with the minister and you have 30 seconds to explain the minister why the thing is relevant you want to talk about. And, well, 30 seconds, so it's very short. Then we have a picture symbolizing the major findings, and we have pros and cons and the punchline of the author. But this all on one page. This sounds unbelievably difficult, and it is. So most authors, and we have now about 100 who have are closing online. We have about 150 in total in production. We have about 200 people who have signed up to write articles of this type. So all of these people have to follow these strict rules. Now, today we discuss a piece of the whole work, which I think is close to our ambitions also in London. We are happy that Mr. Dacon is here from the DFID. We have also a collaboration with for which we work for the ministry, and so it was clear that London would be a good place to talk about our ambitions in development and labor, and that's why I'm grateful that this distinguished group of people are here now and discuss most of the issues. Our approach was, as labor economists, we want to bring in the expertise labor economists and to talk with development economists. Creating jobs to fight poverty was our approach, and so help maybe in this debate, does aid help? Because we know lots of money is spent for aid, and some people say, like in other parts, it was for labor economists that's normal. Labor programs often are spent with a good heart, but when the money is gone, everybody says, oh, this was successful. And so it's similar in development economics with aid. It doesn't help to spend the money. It helps to find out whether the life of people has become better. So evidence and program evaluation is at the heart of what the whole story is, and that's why I'm very grateful that I can handle over to these four experts here to deal with that issue tonight for you. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Klaus.
Well, thank you very much, Klaus. Thank you very much for inviting the London School of Economics to be a partner with IZA. We're very honoured, we're very grateful. And we know, certainly the LSE, that we're a research institution in the same sense with a long tradition, but we're also a very applied institution. We like to try and apply some of the best outcomes of the academic research coming out of the London School of Economics and its global network into policy areas. You reminded me also of something I mentioned earlier about when I did some work with Professor Nick Barr here of the LSE in Hungary in the early days of transition, and we took the 25 years of his research into how to fund higher education systems when you don't have the kind of income that a lot of major countries do. We boiled that down into a 10-point plan for the minister, and we took it to the minister after about 3 years of work, and the minister said, very nice, it's a bit long. So we know exactly how that works. But he was on Newsnight that night, and he had to make 3 points, and he had to convince the electorate, this is why we're doing this, which they did. So we made the 3 points at the end, but of course behind that is 20 years' worth of research. So this is in different markets and different places, but we're delighted to be able to host this event with IZA. We've got a very distinguished panel here looking at different perspectives on the particular issue that we're discussing today about does aid work. I'd like to make a quick mention, if I may, to Robin Casson, who's here, who actually wrote the book called Does Aid Work some years ago, which remains a seminal piece of work in the field. So we have a distinguished panel, not too much time. We have a distinguished audience as well. So we're very grateful for all of you coming to join us today from different perspectives. And something we consider, certainly the LSE, that is very important. We have to get different stakeholders together and make different perspectives on difficult issues understood by different parties. So whether we have NGOs, academics, policymakers, international institutions, very, very important that there are fora where these kinds of debates can take place. So we're very grateful, all of you coming, some of you from across the country and around Europe for this evening tonight. So we're very grateful for that, and we're very grateful for the panel also arrived from the US and someone around the corner and some from DC for coming this evening. So we're very grateful. You've probably guessed by now that I'm not actually Professor Lord Desai, the well-known Indian peer. Unfortunately, he's stuck at the House of Lords in the middle of a debate, which I don't know whether that means he's winning or losing, but he's still in the debate. I hope he's winning. But unfortunately, he won't be able to come here tonight. He sends his regrets. We just found out today at lunchtime, but I'm going to chair the events in his place. Just to introduce the panel, David Robalino is the lead economist in labour markets and the human development anchor of the World Bank. He's editor and author of IZA World of Labour. Thank you very much coming all the way from DC today. We have from LSE Dr. James Putzel, Professor James Putzel, who's Professor of Development Studies here at LSE and one of the pioneers of some of the work in crisis states that he undertook and continues to undertake in some of the most difficult, complex places in the world and trying to help many institutions, different and other agencies make a difference, let's say, on the basis of academic research in different parts of the world. And Gianmarco Ottaviano, who's at the Centre for Economic Performance here at the LSE, one of the finest research centres in the world, certainly at the LSE, who's also a specialist and runs the globalization program at LSE, looking at trade, employment, immigration, and issues like that. So we've got different perspectives, all of which I hope will add a lot of value to the debate. So I'm going to ask just our three speakers to say a few words first, but we'd very much like to take as many questions and create a debate here and get the perspectives that I mentioned beforehand. If I may, I might start with David at the end there, and we'll work our way down, just to say a few points, each person, on some of the perspectives coming out of your research and so on.
So, good evening, everybody. It's a real pleasure to be here. Also an honor to be sharing the panel with distinguished panelists. Thanks for the invitation. I wanted to say a couple of things about this question of does aid work. I guess it's fair to say that most of the debate on the topic has been about how to allocate money across countries. If you look at the papers by David Dollar and others, they were basically focusing on trying to understand whether aid affects economic growth and poverty. And the main message is that it seems to work as long as it goes hand in hand with the right economic policies. So the recommendation is to move money to the countries that have many poor people and where governments know what to do. That's a difficult combination. I guess we can argue here about how robust the results are, but I think there is a more fundamental question, which is about what are those policies. Right? I think the debate shouldn't be about how to allocate money across countries, but how to allocate aid within each of these countries. There are many interventions that the organizations like the World Bank, high-income countries support, being education, health, social protection, infrastructure, rural development, now adaptation, climate adaptation, private sector development. But I think it's fair to say that today we know very little about what is the impacts of all of these programs on outcomes of interest. Think about the old Millennium Development Goals or the new version, things like literacy rates, numeracy rates, mortality rates, employment rates, earnings, of course, poverty. Only in the last 10 years, we have become more serious about trying to understand what is the impact of these programs on outcomes versus outputs. And I think we have made a lot of progress. More impact evaluations are being implemented, but we're not there yet. We do not have a systematic approach to try to understand the impact of these policies. Part of the problem is that they are expensive. They cannot always be implemented. They take time, and sometimes institutions in charge are not interested. So I wanted to give you an example from some of the work we're doing at the World Bank in my department, and it's about youth employment programs. Many countries around the world are implementing these programs to try to connect youth to jobs. Not because the problem of unemployment, many youth in fact are not even participating in the labor market and they don't go to school either. So we came up with an inventory of 800 of these programs that have been implemented worldwide. Hopefully the result of this research is going to feed into the world of labor. And the first question we ask is, of these 800 programs, in many countries, different designs, different implementation mechanisms, different contexts, how many have been evaluated? For how many do we know what is the impact? And it doesn't have to be randomization. Huh? It can be any decent evaluation to have a credible treatment and control group. And the results are very disappointing. Only 80 of the 800 programs have been evaluated. And again, these are programs implemented by governments, private sector, NGOs. Only 80 have been evaluated. And among those 80, only 30% have had a positive impact on labor market outcomes, be it employment rates, number of hours worked, or earnings. The majority, no effect, and a few, a negative impact. So one question is, at least for this 80, we know there is a problem and we can do something about it. What happens with the 720 that haven't been evaluated? Some of these programs continue to be replicated across countries, and we still have a question, are they working? Governments are investing in them, sometimes are borrowing to implement the programs, and maybe the rate of return is not what they expect. So that is one serious issue. The other, and with this I will finish, if you ask me now, what do we know about the programs that had a positive impact? Well, we can tell you actually very little, because these are programs that have been implemented in different contexts. They target very different population groups, even if all of them are young people. It's a very heterogeneous group. And the design and implementation also varies. And we cannot control for all of these variables. So there are some generalities we can tell you. Integrated programs work better than standalone interventions. But even for the programs that are evaluated, it's very difficult to understand why they have an impact and why they don't have an impact. Now, this seems to be it's a very pessimistic speech I'm giving here. I'm very optimistic, but what I think we need to do is to be much more systematic about two things. How we design and implement the new programs, trying to learn systematically from what we already know works or doesn't work. And number two, how to be more systematic about learning also about the implementation of the programs so that we can continue to feed the knowledge base. But this is not an agenda for the World Bank or for the LSE or for IZA. This is an agenda really for the international community, and I will have a couple of ideas of how this will be implemented over time. I hope we'll have a chance to talk about it during the panel discussion. Thank you very much.
Sorry, James, 1 second. So I forgot to mention at the beginning, if anyone is a tweeter in the audience, there's a hashtag which is does aid work, if anyone would like to use that. Okay, thanks. Sorry, James, over to you.
Do you mind if I just stay seated?
That's perfectly acceptable, yes.
I had 3 doctor's appointments today.
Right.
So including a dentist, actually. No, I'm going to speak to some general observations that come out of research. And a lot of our own research was based on much more qualitative investigation, and it did take in the impact of aid in relationship to small n comparative studies and looking much more at processes. But I want to talk in sweeping generalities in order to stimulate some debate. So there's an awful lot of discussion and an awful lot of aid bashing these days in the public domain. And of course we see great popularity in Dambisa Moyo's work, for instance, or now Bill Easterly, formerly many years at the World Bank, now one of the biggest critics of aid. And I think that there does need to be a rebalancing in this public debate. So, which is not to say there's not great problems, and one of the biggest problems you highlighted, I think, and this is so much of so many of the aid programs are not being evaluated in any kind of scientific or systematic way. What we observed, and what I think if one can observe, even in the most aid-dependent countries, where aid is making really quite a positive impact, it's related to just how clear and systematic a government has evolved a development strategy and program. So if we look at Rwanda today, it's not particularly democratic, doesn't do too well on David Dollar's criteria that he outlined 2 decades ago. But Rwanda and Ethiopia are making very good use of their aid on almost any measure. And it's we need to understand why that's so. And it certainly requires an evaluation that goes beyond the criteria of transparency, accountability, and this sort of thing. But clearly what came out of at least our investigations into the contrast between, for instance, Rwanda and Tanzania's use of aid has to do with the quality of their development strategy, their own Vision 2020 for the future is internalized by almost everybody in the government and much of the private sector. And you meet people out in the countryside and they know the development strategy. So I think that there's something really important to take away from that. One of the biggest issues that came up around aid in our own study of states in difficult situations was the very big problem of the impulse to deliver aid programs quickly by bypassing state systems. And people say, all the more you have to bypass them in places where the state systems are very weak. But in fact, it's just the opposite. All the more one has to work through state systems, unless one's going to undermine the state. So there's some very interesting and important work being done to look at how can you get aid on budget in these questions, in these countries. Ministries of finance are trying to develop public financial management programs, and they have no clue where the aid money is going. So the donors themselves, despite having this reporting system through the OECD and whatnot, it looks quite nice on the website of OECD. When you drill into it, one finds that it's very difficult for those trying to build financial management systems to have any kind of sound information from the donors. So one turns the lens the other way around, I think, than what has often been done in the discussion of aid. When I was doing research on the politics of the HIV/AIDS crisis, there was major evidence that the effort to get aid quickly into to fight the epidemic by bypassing government systems actually undermined a number of public health systems in favor of the shorter-term objectives of fighting the epidemic. So that's a controversial thing to say, but I think there's a lot of evidence around that. The third thing I wanted to comment on is if we look at the patterns of aid over the long term, we see that a sharp decline over time in aid going to anything to do with productive sectors in developing countries. So and a big rise in aid to the soft governance issues, etc. And this is not only production sectors, like the decline of aid from the mid-1980s, still about 12% of aid going to agriculture. By now, only about 2% of OECD aid. The aid to manufacturing and industry has almost entirely disappeared. And even aid to economic infrastructure has declined in favor of these other uses of aid. And I think it's there's a very problematic record there. We once had people in DFID and in the bilateral agencies who were experts in agricultural economics, who knew something about the real productive base, which development is all about. And we don't have those people. We have specialists in governance and whatnot. It's a little bit like, if we look at the developmental states, they have their officials very often trained in engineering. When we look at the less developmental states, they're often lawyers or sometimes economists. So I mean, and this brings me to the next point, and that has to do with this rather interesting development of new emergent donors, the BRICS. China now is becoming a major actor in sub-Saharan Africa. Often it's difficult to distinguish between what's its aid and what's its investment. But I've been working in the last 2 years with a new China International Development Research Network, which is involving some of the major Chinese universities. DFID is providing some money to this effort, and it's an effort to fund research of young academics who are getting involved in the evaluation of the impact of these investment in aid programs. A lot of that work is small end, comparative stuff, but it's just beginning to produce some interesting insights. There is one of the reasons there's a step change here, and also I think a generally positive reception of this Chinese thrust in Africa is that for the first time, after decades of promises, there's really significant funds going back into things that have direct impact on production and wealth creation. So of course there's many difficult problems here, and there's great fears being raised in the West that all the efforts to kind of curb rent-seeking and fight corruption will be undermined by this Chinese thrust. But if we look, and certainly I saw it when I was doing the work on aid in crisis states, if we look at the transaction costs that are related to an awful lot of these micro aid programs of Western countries around governance and other soft issues, they're enormous for states that are weak in personnel and trying to rebuild themselves after economic crisis, or even worse, military and violent crisis. So I think there's the new story, really, what's really shaking up the aid world is the rise of the BRICS. We have now, of course, it's largely a political phenomenon for the moment, but the declaration of the new BRICS Bank in the face of a World Bank that has a great deal of inertia on it, in the face of an IMF whose reform in order to allow greater voice to come from the emerging powers in the South has been blocked by the U.S. Congress systematically. You know, this is a new aid horizon, and it offers a lot of opportunities, frankly. So, thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, well, first, I'm an economist, so probably I shouldn't now be able to speak. No, but more seriously. So, there are clearly things that probably economists cannot do, but what we try to do, and probably we are able to do, is to quantify the effects of things we have developed. And the CEP in particular, we have developed, and IZA, of course. We have developed as a profession, as a group of scientists, methods to quantify the effects of all sorts of things. So probably what we can do, and we try to do, is to provide the tools for quantifying, precisely what David was asking for. And indeed, I mean, the question of what works and what doesn't work is probably the thing that is more at the core of what is contemporary economics. Mm-hmm. And when you get to the question what works and what doesn't work, then you start to have to make decisions of what kind of effects you want really to look at. Because, I mean, it's clearly the general picture is you provide aid and then this is guiding or fostering development. But then when you want to measure things, you have to be more precise than that. So works that we do, that other people do, I'm just highlighting four possible effects that I think are quite relevant and on which quantitative analysis can be done. Because one issue with quantitative analysis is that sometimes simply you cannot do that. So it would be great to know the effects and to measure the pros and cons and cost and benefits, but sometimes you don't have the data, or the data that you have are not reliable, or I mean, they are not randomized. You were mentioning before, so that you actually don't know exactly what you're getting out of this data. So the four areas I would like just to stress, one I think is, the first is about human capital accumulation in developing countries. And this is something that is mainly related to the analysis of migration flows and the idea that you may as well manage to produce human capital, accumulate human capital in developing countries, but maybe what you're going to get in the end is that these brains are moving away. So it is a big area of analysis in our field is precisely about brain drain. So you give money to develop the human capital, the skills of the local population, then the brightest and those who can just move away. And this is something that I think is going to be exacerbated in the futures if this current trend of developed countries of selecting immigrants based on the skills, and so trying to get the high-skill immigrants only, is going to go on in the future. So I think this idea of connecting selectivity at the border in our countries to the brain drain is something that I've not seen yet developed, and for sure it's not in the public debate, and politicians don't even think about that. But maybe something about trying to put together this aspect would be something that is clearly important. The second area is about technology transfer. This is precisely what has just been discussed. You would like to give aid to promote the development of the local economy. So what has been done sometimes in the past and sometimes with quite successful outcomes is to put money into the study of crops that are particularly fit for specific places. And there are a lot of projects in this area. Clearly, those who are running this processes are quite good in assessing whether it is successful or not, because you develop a crop, you plant a crop, and then you see what comes out. That's pretty easy to do. But the connection to the amount of money that has been spent in order to do this to obtain this sort of result, at least to me, is still something that is worth investigating a bit more. And the same is aid to manufacturing that has just been mentioned. This is something that has been disappearing. But again, it's not only about crops, it's also about other technologies that could be adapted, products that could be adapted and developed locally. It doesn't have to be sort of radical innovation or radical technological change, but simple adaptation and penetration of technologies in this country is something that aid could target and that could be also quantified. Then there is aid and trade. We see that generally, I mean, even though the direction of causation is something that is often hard to decide, to assign, but we often see that development and trade in terms of imports and exports, they go hand in hand. So you may wonder about the direction of causation, but clearly if trade is not growing, if these countries are not being integrated in the international trade networks, it's a sign that probably development in those countries is not working. And so this is somewhere where intervention can be achieved. Again, there are studies that also at the CP we are following that are looking actually at the details of the way through which, say, potential exporters from these countries or importers are matched with the counterparts in other countries. There is the north-south direction, which is, of course, something that is easier to analyze because at least we have good data on the north side. But fundamental is really the south-south direction. And there, again, I've not seen much in terms of quantification of effects. And then finally, there is aid and conflict, which is, of course, something that is possibly beyond the economic dimension. But there is here this, I was looking into this by IZA. You have this thing on public works programs. And I mean, we are people at the Department of Economics here at the LSE who are studying really the relation between the cyclical use of public works to absorb possibly people that have lost their job or, I mean, after severe weather conditions, they've not been able to produce anything on their land, to absorb these people into public works, and the relation between this sort of insurance against bad outcome and conflict, and it seems that that there are studies that are being at the department they are doing on India in particular, in certain areas of India, where you see that actually using these public works as this is to protect from shocks, which is what also IZA is talking about, as this additional effect of some way mitigating the conflicts during bad periods. So these are just 4 examples of things that can be quantified and are being quantified, and I will stop here.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Thanks very much, Gianmarco. Thank you very much. Let me just ask a couple of questions, if I may, and start a debate here. Coming back to you, James, if I may. What about something of a relatively recent phenomenon about the scale of, let's call it, philanthropic aid that's been channeled through different media with NGOs working in different countries, but also the difference between perhaps trying to evaluate what is coming from private sector foundations into aid environments that can be of a very large scale and have effects that looks for different outcomes, but also looks for different ways in which they evaluate the money that is being spent, which is obviously in the many billions. So as well as does aid work, what kind of aid? Obviously a broad question, but is there some way in which you can evaluate or analyse the 2 different kinds or the sources through which some is public policy and some is philanthropic, and what are those effects?
Well, if you're asking me in particular, obviously this is a big new phenomenon. It seems to have the biggest impact in very targeted, with very specific aims.
Right.
So if you look at the Gates Foundation and the health sector, they've made a difference in different ways. how much they've contributed to building public health systems through these programs, I'm going to leave it to my two colleagues here to actually measure it for us, because it's a little bit dubious, actually. I mean, in the sense that a lot of the philanthropic aid is very targeted. I wouldn't say that it's having negative impact in most cases, probably having quite important positive impact, but it's often contributing to the trend for aid to go off budget, and not necessarily to contribute to building systems that are replicable over time. So it's going to be very important to look at what is still a halting progress, I think. I mean, I haven't done any research on this specifically. Maybe Robert has looked at this, but the new efforts to invest in green revolution technology for Africa, this has to, if we really learned the lessons from Asia, we would see that this has to go hand in hand with building up expertise in ministries of agriculture, agricultural extension works and whatnot. The sign of the times is private sector delivery for much of these things, and it's frankly problematic in terms of scaling up and operating in ways that bring about what we used to talk about as structural transformation of an economy. So there's a lot of positive philanthropic work going on, but its priorities are often not driven by what states are demanding, and very often state officials have to accommodate themselves with the funds that are available. And of course they often will, because when you're in that situation, you'll take substantial funds from wherever they're coming, and it'll be a dedicated program. Many countries have built up this capacity to deal with the HIV/AIDS crisis, but said, actually in our health system, basic public and preventative health are starving of resources, but the money's locked in. So I think that's the way that I would answer that.
David, is that something you would agree with in terms of from an institutional perspective and the World Bank?
I guess I also have mixed feelings about what the private sector is trying to do. I think the intentions are very good, and I deal with issues related to jobs. We interact with some of the foundations that are investing money in this area, MasterCard Foundation, Rockefeller Foundation. So the foundations essentially are supporting the work operations of international NGOs, for instance, the International Youth Foundation. But the issue they are facing, I think, and is related to what I said before, there hasn't been a culture to try to understand what is the impact of all of these programs that they are trying to implement worldwide. It's changing, but what is difficult for them, once you have a business model, once you have a set of training programs that you implement wherever you go, it's risky to do an evaluation and suddenly learn that your model needs to be changed because possibly it is not working. So that is an issue. We also have a major issue of coordination. So the same foundations, the same NGOs going to the same countries trying different things without talking to each other. Even when they do these evaluations I was talking about, then it's very difficult to compare because the initiatives are so different, right? That even if you know that there was a positive impact, you do not know why. So I guess the challenge that the governments and again the international community faces is try to leverage, coordinate all these resources that are out there, not only the public money but also money coming from the private sector, which, as you say, is growing.
Yeah, sure. Thank you. Gianmarco, a slightly different question. I know you've worked on issues around government decision-making around trade and which ways in which policies are attempted to be introduced into encouraging growth, whether it's export-led growth or different areas. Have you noticed a changing pattern in recent years, or is it something that way in which international trade agreements are encouraging growth prospects for some of the developing countries, or is it something that's becoming more of a problem?
Well, I mean, probably the most important trend in trade agreements in the last decades has been a growth in regional agreements, which is a mixed blessing in the sense that the multilateral agreements have stalled completely, I would say. And the logic of multilateral agreements was that, I mean, you have the big guys sitting at the table, but in the end, whatever they agree and whatever concession they make to each other, this is going to be extended to everybody else. So the small guys would get the same sort of treatment and sometimes even better treatment. Now with this trend towards regional trade agreement, we hear a lot about, it's European Union and United States and the Pacific areas. In a sense, it seems that this tendency is running the risk of going back to a situation in which only the big guys are making agreements and the others, if they're lucky, they would get extensions, but they're not going to be part of the process. On the other side, I mean, the second big development has been that was mentioned at the beginning was the emergence of new big players. And these big players are, sometimes they're presenting themselves as champions of the developing world, but whether this is really the case, it really depends on what they're talking about. So I would say that there are these two developments that are a bit mixed in terms of developing countries. Regionalism, very risky. Emerging big players maybe can help.
I think we'll take a few questions because we have many people here, and we have 3 already. 4, excellent, good to hear. You were first, so why don't you go first if you can?
Yes, Mr. Robalino, you told us you had 2 solutions, and then you sat down.
Are we taking the questions? We go around?
I think we'll take them one by one to start with. If we run out of time, we'll take a few if we can.
What we are trying to do now, and again, this is more related to the area of jobs, but I guess that similar models can be considered for other types of, call them development challenges, is to create, if you want, a coalition that brings together academia, some of the most important NGOs involved in the sector, universities, and try to do 2 things. First, to systematically take a stock of what we know already about certain interventions that we are replicating very often, again, related to jobs. So what do we know about the training programs, employment services, the role of wage subsidies. It's not an open-ended list, but interventions that most governments are using now and for which we have some evidence, yes or no. And the second step would be to have a research agenda, an evaluation agenda that is implemented but in coordination with the partners, if you want, of this coalition. To give you an example, if we're going to be working on a training program and talking about the private sector, we know that it's more likely to have success if you have private providers of training linking the beneficiaries to employers. What are the types of contracts and payment systems that you need to have in place to make them work? Having different types of contract and payment systems, a menu of those, and replicating the same program in different settings where only that part of the intervention changes. That is the only way to, over time, being able to see what really is making the difference, versus trying a completely different intervention someplace else, because this is what the person in charge of that evaluation had in mind for innovation. So coordinating the innovations around different interventions, so that then we can start really comparing the results. It's not easy to do, but I think that it has to be done eventually.
Thanks. There's another one next door, and then, yeah, please.
I'm reluctant to ask this question in light of Professor Putzel's introduction. I began my academic career as an economist and have spent my life as a practicing lawyer. I'm going to use my lawyer to slightly rephrase the question for the proposition that surely the aid of AIM is to make itself irrelevant. And my question is based out not of academic research, but an article in The Economist last week, which talked about it took us 100 years to get the rules understood to bring out of poverty through the Industrial Revolution. The digital revolution is now making all of those considerations largely irrelevant. And I'm curious how any of you see the evolution of this digital revolution affecting the ultimate irrelevance of aid.
James, would you like to go first, and then maybe Gianmarco
Sure.
after for comment?
I mean, obviously, this technology is having huge impact everywhere, and I suppose, I think one of the biggest impacts it's having is on providing people with new lines of finance and access to financial systems, which they didn't have before. So this actually has this big possibilities. But whether or not those can be channeled into something that leads to a kind of structural change in these places, a kind of step change in economic development, still is going to have depend on the quality of state action in these economies. And just two things come to my mind, so I'm just responding off the top of my head. One is that one of the things that was present in the past was that to create various forms of extension systems, market information, economic connections, one actually had to physically connect places in developing countries. So it involved building roads, and just to have communication required physical integration. So there's a potentially downside to the digital cyberspace in places where it's being introduced where there's no physical infrastructure in terms of the separateness of places and the way in which it may empower small actors but not bigger actors. And the other thing I would say is that I just came back just before term started, so just a few weeks ago, from Zhejiang in China. And this is one of the provinces in China where manufacturing has taken off, and the provincial government officials have sort of favored the development of small and medium enterprise. And here you see the kind of synergy that's going on between a public regulatory authority that's trying to really build infrastructure and whatnot for these traders to operate, and to facilitate, by the way, African traders and whatnot coming. There's huge numbers of them in Zhejiang province, and talking to some of the companies there, as well as the state officials presiding over this, the largest small commodity market in the world now, I think, is in Yiwu in Zhejiang. Talking with them, they said, well, now the future is e-commerce. But what they're doing differently is that they're tying every actor in e-commerce to a physical place in Yiwu. So they have a shop as they expand in markets first in China, but then beyond China's boundaries in e-commerce. And it's quite an interesting idea. Why? Because one of the biggest risks in all of that e-commerce is fraud, and people having no way of tracking them physically, and secondly, for a lot of countries, and even countries with great capacity like China, how will you tax this sector? I mean, so that it contributes to developing the resources for public and national development, and so here, I think there's big opportunities posed by this. And you're right, there's huge step changes that are introduced with digital divide, but still some very old-fashioned questions are posed even more sharply than before in terms of the relationship between public authority and private actors in a way that's synergistic to lead to good social development outcomes.
Gianmarco, we know from some of the economics evidence about the investments in technology, but it isn't so clear how much that is linked to growth, in fact, compared to the effect of the impact of technology to bring people out of poverty in emerging economies or in advanced economies as well. Some of your work on globalization, do you see technology or technological developments having the kind of impact that one would expect, or is it yet unclear?
So, I mean, rather than answering the big question, I would like to bring like two anecdotes. They're more than anecdotes. At least one of them is a very well-published paper, which on the effects of these new technologies on developing countries. So, one thing that we all notice is that we went through, in terms of telephones, we went through landlines and then mobile phones. In several of these countries, landlines were simply not there, and it was almost impossible to get landlines. Now they're getting instead mobile phones. And so there have been studies, I have in mind a study in particular that has taken a very specific case, so fishermen in a limited area in a developing country. The problem was, I'm a fisherman, my family lives on what I can get by selling my food. And I have to, so I fish, it is warm, it's humid. I have several markets, local markets that I have to reach, but I can reach only one per day, essentially. And by the time I made the decision, I've reached the market, either I sell or the fish is gone. I mean, it's really it's perishable in a sense. I don't have any alternative. So this study was a study that was really looking at the effect of mobile phones in this sort of economy, which is very, if you want, basic economy, but that's why it was interesting. And what they've seen is that having mobile phones solves the problem of allocation of your daily fish across markets, because the time you get your fish, you get you get information. You say, where should I go today? A couple of phone calls and you can target the market. So I think this is a very nice anecdote in the sense that it's showing how the allocation of resources in difficult environments can be improved by communication. Another example is about healthcare, in the sense that we are used in developing countries when we have a problem. We go to the doctor, we go to the hospital, and all the machinery is there, and we get scanned, and we get all the analysis that we need. In a lot of developing countries, and here now I'm talking about India because this was related to India, this is simply impractical. I mean, there's no way you can bring people that are ill across kilometers to some place which anyway is overcrowded. So there are companies like GE, General Electric, that are devising new machinery that is light, that can be brought to where the people are, in terms of analyzing what is going on and scanning the problems, etc. Now, we are back to the fisherman problem. If you don't know exactly, if you don't have the communication, the fast communication that can tell you where to bring this apparatus, then you're only stuck halfway. I mean, you're not going to solve the problem. So now we see that there are specific technologies. Here is the example of this medical machinery that are going to be developed for emerging economies because of their specific needs. A little bit like crops that we were talking about, crops before. And then these new technologies of communication are giving new potential applications to these new technologies, because without that, as I said before, you can really develop some portable device that is able to assist a lot of people, but if you don't know where to go, it's really useless in the end. So I would say these are two examples of how technology can help.
Okay. Take another, let's take one here and then you're okay. As well at the back as well, please.
Thank you. My question is regarding the relationship between trade and building productive capacities that you mentioned. That is basically the Aid for Trade initiative that was born some years ago. But I would like to know what are your ideas on this kind of disconnection between traditional donors that are mostly focusing on addressing basic needs and emerging donors who are trying to address more of a structural gaps. How do you think those ideas can be reconciled, or
David,
I think this
start.
question is
for Gianmarco. We'll start with Gianmarco.
You don't want to answer.
I mean, I didn't understand the second part of the question. Basic need versus a structural problem.
I mean, I've seen that traditional donors are trying to address basic needs. Sanitation,
MDGs.
yes, basic. While emerging donors are focusing more on a structural gap, infrastructure, building trade capacity. So what are your thoughts on that? Or how can that gap be bridged? Or are, for example, these developed countries more likely to be working with emerging donors?
On that, I have a view. First of all, I don't think the trend is like that. I think the trend is the opposite. That traditionally, organizations like the World Bank were focusing on infrastructure, the hard sectors, the real sectors, and that more and more now we are entering into human development, interventions to improve human development, develop safety nets, improve governance, the soft stuff. And I think there has to be a balance. I think there has to be a balance because all of these interventions are complementary. I don't think you can be developing public work programs. You were mentioning public work programs, for instance, which will be what you qualify as more providing or satisfying basic needs. If at the end of the day you do not start to create improving earnings opportunities for the beneficiaries of those projects, and that will for sure imply improving, particularly in African and low-income countries, infrastructure. So I think both approaches are complementary.
Yeah. So in my catch is, I agree with what has just been said. My impression is that when private money is involved, the donors really will want to see exactly where this money is going and what is generating. So they want to have a deliverable in the end. I mean, something they can say, okay, this is where my money went. And that is why probably it's easier to attract, or you see more of this money into very specific programs targeted at fighting a certain disease or some specific conditions. There are a lot of things that developed countries need for which this sort of private money is probably not available, because it's not I'm paying for this glass of water to be delivered, but I'm paying for institution building. So how do I measure the deliverable here? So I see a lot of complementarity, and probably these developments in which starting to understand what can private money achieve, not in terms of, I mean, money is the same whether it's public or private, but where you can get private money involved with respect to where instead you really need public money because no private money would go. I think it's an important issue for coordination.
Thank you. There's one here, yeah, and then you. Thanks, please.
So, both the theoretical and the empirical literature has suggested that the best way to overcome the agency problem, particularly moral hazard problem that characterizes the relationship between donor and a recipient country, it would be to implement conditionality on performance, on outcome. And I was wondering whether the World Bank does actually implement conditionality on something, and if not, why?
Actually, this is a very tricky question. I don't know if I should be answering. But the bank has a long history trying to implement programs, and actually this is related to the literature I mentioned before, David Dollar and company, trying to lend money conditional on certain policy changes. And there are different views on this, but I guess the consensus is that forcing governments to try to implement certain policies in exchange for the money simply is not the way to go. It hasn't worked. It hasn't worked. And the money is following actually the bad governments. Because those are the ones who have something to show to get the money, right? They can promise to implement a policy change to get the money. The new trend now in what we have at the bank is called development policy lending, is to provide budget support for programs owned by the government and disburse the money when 2-3 elements of that program have been implemented, but not because it's a conditionality. It's more, you have a work program we believe it makes sense, it looks, these interventions seem to be the right interventions, we will help you implement. But it's very different from I'm going to give you the money if you do something, if you change your policies. Now, if you ask me, is this new approach, development policy lending, effective? It is still to be seen, because some of these reforms are very difficult to implement. They don't depend only from the executive power who is controlling who is having the dialogue with the bank. Some of these reforms have to go to Congress. Then it's very difficult to know whether they go through, yes or no. But it's a very different approach from "I will give you the money because you have the wrong policies if you change them."
I think I'm just going to ask the others to contribute. I think it's a very important question, and if I may come to you, thanks, James, a quick comment on that.
Well, I mean, I think the evidence is you've talked to the evidence. The conditionality has not worked very well at all, and I mean, in some of the really big studies of what was the impact of all the structural adjustment programs, like Nick van der Waals' kind of comprehensive look at this in sub-Saharan Africa, showed that little was achieved. And there has been really interesting progress in relationship to various kinds of budget support. And we do come back to very basic things like transaction costs and what's been involved in this kind of micromanaging of conditionality in the past. So it's, I welcome when I see the World Bank moving towards this kind of management of its aid, though I don't think the same could be said for all the bilaterals. I mean, DFID has done more in this regard than some of the others. There's still a huge amount of aid that is tied to projects. And of course, that's not necessarily formally, stated as conditionality, but it's a kind of aid delivery that has very high transaction costs and often involves huge amount of duplication between donors, and almost any measure has some very questionable kind of outcomes.
Yeah, I mean, my view on this is that it really depends on what kind of project you have in mind. I mean, there are projects for which conditionality makes a lot of sense, and others for which probably doesn't make much sense. And I would say that if you're looking for something that is, if you're looking for projects that are ambitious, and what in Silicon Valley would be called moonshots, I mean, if you really want these sort of projects, conditionality is not going to work. I mean, you cannot make some giant leap conditional on an achievement. You can go along the way and see, well, I mean, you said you were going to do this and that and this, so let's check. And so along the way may stop this project simply because it's too risky in the end, or it's not promising. On the other hand, for a lot of projects for which it's clear what you have to deliver, then conditionality is more promising. So I would say that it really depends on the type of project you have in mind.
Quick comment and we'll go to,
just to clarify, because what I said before applies to budget support programs, right? You give money to the budget, to the Minister of Finance, and that money then goes to the budget. You don't know exactly what happens with each dollar, say, but there are conditions or not conditions attached to that money. And I'm saying in that context, conditionalities haven't worked. Different is investment lending, where you are lending money to implement a given project. It can be building a hospital, it can be employment programs for youth. And then, of course, it's a different business. Hopefully you get an agreement in the way you design and implement the program based on evidence. In that case, I think it's important, in fact, to make sure that you give money only when certain conditions are respected when it comes to the design implementation of the program to be negotiated.
Thank you. We had a question there, and then we'll come to you. Yes, please. You have to speak up from the back. Sorry.
My question is about evaluation. So, what do you think the evaluation system should be like? Especially, who should do the evaluation? Because I think that if donors, like donor countries or banks, have to do the evaluation, they may have a moral hazard that they present the result as they had a good result. And also, they may have different criteria, like depending on whether World Bank does the evaluation or each country does the evaluation. And so I think they are not willing to do the evaluation because of the administrative cost. So basically, my question is, who should do the evaluation?
Thank you. Very good question. Yes, David.
Sorry.
Yeah.
My view on this, is that eventually the evaluations should be done systematically by an independent agency within the country, not by the World Bank, not by LSE. These institutions can build the local capacity, but that culture of evaluation needs to become an integral part of public policy design in developing countries. And some of the countries are already starting to do this, and I'm talking about middle, low-income countries. But as you say, there are at least three challenges. One is that this costs money, probably that you can overcome. These evaluations require technical expertise that is often not there. You don't have enough people in some of these countries who are able to do it. I guess you can train them. But then probably the main challenge is political. Do really governments, agencies have the incentive to learn and understand what they are trying to do? When some of the evaluations might simply say this is not working. You need to do completely different. And when some of these programs, in fact, are attached to certain political parties, that part is complicated, difficult to deal with.
James.
I mean, it really is interesting to look at differential practice. So, I mean, I'm mentioning Rwanda quite often because I was doing some research there. And, there are real performance indicators within their state. I mean, these are not imposed by the donor. And, your promotion in the place, your position, your continued employment in the state agency, you really have to meet certain performance targets. So one does need to look at, well, how are public sectors structured in different places, right? We've been much more concerned about, I think the foreign donor community has been much more concerned in recent years about sort of democratic procedures than some of these, nuts and bolts of public administration and how it's measured and whether there's some kind of meritocracy operating. So I think that's really important to bring back into the picture. But you yourself talked about how there are kind of fads that go behind donor funding, so that we have, because it's kind of accepted that unemployed youth are a source of conflict. You must concentrate on employment creation programs across lots of so-called fragile countries, and only 10% of these, programs have been evaluated. That's right. And it's true. I mean, ODI has also recently published a paper that's showing just how little evaluation has been done of all this. So it became a truth because Paul Collier, at one point, suggested it, and it's been multiplied by a number of agencies without that kind of evaluative process. But I agree 100% that there should be local evaluation. I was suggesting quite a few years ago first to NGOs, but then to DFID, that its developing country partners come and evaluate its work or their work in the North. We've never had something like this. I mean, from our own academic point of view, I would like to see anthropologists from China and from Kenya coming to do anthropological investigations in London and English villages and German towns. We don't do that. And then yet there's a talk about this partnership in the donor. I mean, there's a very asymmetric partnership that's going on, and it is a big problem.
I think that when it is about private money, the donor should evaluate, and then for all the rest, I shared what has been discussed.
We had yes, please. Yeah.
I just wonder whether, it's not a question, it's just all these things that you're saying and seeing it from the point of view of how we're doing it all in different. So I'm on some of the things that were mentioned. So, if we start even from the basic question, so does aid work? That's something we can't even start with because we need to do it. We have a budget and we need to spend. For us, the question very quickly becomes what you do with the aid and how do you do it. And I think it's a bit striking because a lot of the research has always been about, you know, does the volume, just adding up all the volume, and does that correlate with something? You remember you mentioned there what I would call a very old paper by Collier and Dollar. I hope the World Bank has moved on.
Exactly.
But in a sense, it turns much more into a kind of a micro question. You know, what you do with it exactly, how do you allocate and how do you do it? And I think the how you do it is something that really comes up more and more, and it's, I suppose it links up with this question of conditionality. You know, I was a bit surprised with the question because we do know it doesn't work. That's one thing we know. But it's extremely hard to educate your policymakers, your politicians, to actually not to want to invoke it all the time because, you know, the repeated game we've been playing with aid for 50 years has meant that, you know, we have very little credibility to play the conditionality game. But the politician is in power for a very short period and thinks we can still play it. And we could name some countries that James has been mentioned quite a few times where indeed political conditionality, of course, has very little impact. So, but we're looking for ways, you know, what you describe. To be honest, I'm not convinced it will work. It's another thing. People are experimenting with, you know, can we do it with payment by results and all kinds of things.
Right.
But again, there's going to be very specific types of things where we can do these things. And it's going to be a whole thing. So it leads me to the other thing, and James made some interesting points on it. You know, in an ideal world, I think as different, has always been an organization that would love to work in partnership. Budget support is something we have supported very, very strongly. You know, it's on the way out. It is a little bit going down. Because increasingly, you know, the idea of a partner is that you want to have a partner that somehow has forms of shared commitment, shared objectives. And so we've been doing quite a lot of work in trying to actually say, well, you know, where does aid work best? Is that we have, broadly speaking, in countries where there is some kind of elite settlement, political settlement, that is more or less in favor of something to do with growth and poverty reduction. And of all the 30 questions where we have bilateral core programs, 2 came out where we would say this is the case. I can't quite name them, although one has been mentioned quite regularly. And they're not necessarily nice countries, if I put it like this, from a liberal point of view or something. They're not necessarily nice countries. So there's maybe 5 others where you could do it. What do you do in the others? And that's actually a little bit to James' a question back. We would love to work with state systems, but I spent my summer last year in the DRC. You know, if the state is imagined, if the state is non-existent, what do I do then? So I think, and in fact the biggest challenge for aid is that we do understand we would like to work with the state because that's sustainable, but how do we build this state? How can we use aid to build the state, you know? And that leads me to another point that James started with. Yes, the emerging powers are playing another game, which is very much focusing on kind of an economic model of development. Actually, for China, aid is transactional. You know, it's all about the rate of return to the project. It's not quite aid in another way. And I do want us to focus more on productive sectors. And indeed, we have loads of people that love James and our governance advisors, but I will tell them now that you want to get rid of them in debate. I will tell them that we have too many of them.
I've been telling them that for years.
Yeah, well, as an economist, I can't quite tell them that. And for example, now, Secretary of State now, and whether we like it or not, you know, said now, okay, we're going to actually, all new spending, 30% has to go to economic development type of thing, productive sectors. But it's a very strange thing, it's a very difficult thing, because if you're working in a politics that is not really focused on that, how do you do that? So the dilemmas are there. So if anyone, if I would say where the frontier of research on does aid work is actually, how do you get countries to govern themselves better? How do you actually get states to be built? How do you get state systems to be built that you can partner with effectively? Now, I'm not sure it's the right question, but I would say that we often feel it's not. And so finally on the, okay, maybe two very quick points on, so on the emerging powers. That's actually quite an interesting thing, and it's something, well, actually I'm quietly proud of it, since James is mentioning it, they're all doing it. So we've changed our China program to focus an office in China that focuses on Africa. So the only thing the office does is focusing on Africa and trying to engage with China on Africa, because that's actually where the future partnership will lie. It is actually what these, you know, it's not anymore in Washington that it's happening, it's also in Beijing. So we need to be there and trying to find ways of doing this. And I can't help make a point on the brain drain that you mentioned. you know, it's actually interesting. Of course, it's a no-go area for DIFT. We don't work on international migration. HMG doesn't really particularly find it comfortable to work on this. But there's a huge amount of evidence that actually international migration is a pretty interesting way and quite a good way. And I will definitely send